The evolution of the corset. So, first of all, when I'm referring to a corset, I want to start out by saying that this began in a much different iteration than what we think of a corset today, because women have worn corsets, a snug fitting garment over the bust to offer warmth, support, and protection for centuries. Um, so we know that from our costume history that the earliest clothing was probably made from leaves and bark. So this is an example of a corset type garment that would be made out of a palm frond. And this is an example of an Victorian corset that has the lace up back. So how did we get from this to this? Okay, so we know that in the Minoan culture, which was about 3000 BC, there were depictions of women wearing kind of bandeau wraps around the bust and sort of bikini bottoms that were doing sport or dancing. And we know that in the Egyptian culture, women were often bare-breasted. So it makes sense that if women were doing active things like hunting, cooking, gathering herbs or in the forest, that they would want some sort of protection. And the same way men would want to wear a loincloth, women would want to cover themselves for protection and also for support. In more laid back or relaxed cultures, such as the Pacific Islands, for example, women were bare-breasted more. And also in aristocratic cultures like the ancient Egyptian garments that we see, these women were probably pretty relaxed and had probably servants and maybe didn't need the kind of protection that a woman who's taking care of livestock and out in the woods. So we know that in medieval times, in the Middle Ages, there are words written about making corsets out of hemp or goat hair and using reeds or sticks to construct them. I actually put together this corset this morning out of some roughly woven hemp and leather and laced it up, and I was kind of thinking about sticks, so I have some sticks here that have been sewn in and pieces of leather, and trying to imagine what an early corset would have looked like made with goat hair and sticks or reed. Anyway, kind of interesting to imagine what that would look like. From there, it evolved into a kirtle, which was a rectangle of garment that was snugly fitted around the chest area and tended to flatten women, and it was laced either in the front or the side or the back, and sometimes even had a skirt attached to it. Kirtle. It would be worn with an undergarment. From there, in the Renaissance, they started doing more cutting and shaping, and things began to be more fitted. And by the 1500s, full-on French court costume demanded that women had a tiny waist, and the history of the corset as we know it kind of developed from there. So corsetry used whale bones, usually to sculpt a woman's shape, and as styles changed, it became sort of evolved from a sort of a flat Georgian shape, or what we call a stomacher, which was a sort of a V-shaped piece that flattened the silhouette and was usually quite embellished to what is more developed into an Elizabethan and then into the Victorian silhouette. So the Victorian silhouette is characterized by a very hourglass shape. And so this was the era where we see the cartoons of two people lacing up a woman from the back and pulling in her waist super tight to achieve that tiny waist, and lots of boning and sometimes came to the bust apex, sometimes a little bit above with some lace, and sometimes right at the bust apex. So um, uh, around that time, let's say the late 19th century, corsetry reached its peak in that sort of uh, uncomfortable, super tight sense. And there began to be protests against that. And people felt they were unhealthy. People felt that it was buying into a slave mentality, which may be true, kind of a male conspiracy again about women's position. And because obviously women that were laced into these super tight corsets were not able to bend over very easily, they tended to breathe very shallowly, they were not active at all. So it reached a point where women wanted more freedom of movement and more independence from men and marriage, and they wanted to work for wages, and the movement began. It is said that uh, uh, the designer Madame Vianney was the first one to do away with the corset altogether. This would have been in the probably teens, 1910, 1920, and also Paul Poiret, started designing more loose-fitting garments without corsets, and scandalized society, of course. But then as we moved into the 20s and that sort of elongated silhouette, those corsets were replaced by a bra and a girdle. So when you think about the modern day girdle that sort of smoothed the line and replaced the corset. There was a bit of a resurgence after World War II when Dior came out with his new look, which was again very waist conscious kind of look and waist cinchers. But really, the corset saw its heyday in that late 20th century, kind of late 18th century, let's say 1500s to 1900 was the main era of the corsets. But I would like to say that even during that time when corsets had that reputation for being super tight and super uncomfortable, I will say that that was not for everyone. Those were the aristocrats that were wearing those tight-fitting corsets. And for the average woman, the peasant woman who was working in the fields, taking care of children, taking care of livestock, it was a much different story. It was still a corset, but it was probably more loosely fitting. It was probably more comfortable materials, and it offered support and protection. So in other cultures too, there were garments that were worn by women for that kind of support and protection. In the Chinese culture, there was a garment called a dudu, which was simply a diagonal diamond-shaped piece of fabric that was worn over the bust and midriff, flattening women out. And it also contained little pouches where there were herbs and medicinal things that were kept over this area to improve the stomach qi, the energy, the ancient Chinese belief in the energy of the chakras. So there were herbs that were used in the undergarments to help invigorate certain energies. So the corset as an undergarment has to be seen as more than just the classic definition of the uncomfortable corset of that era. It's evolved into a bra, and certainly in our modern world, I would say a large percentage of the female population wears bras because we feel protected and supported, and they offer warmth. So we need to think about the corsets as a garment that did offer warmth and support and protection, and not just think of it as the uncomfortable versions that we mostly think of with corsets.